What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it magic, and we're on the couch. Twitter told me to do the couch and not the office today. Like 75% of people on Twitter said sit on the couch. So here we are for the core set top 25 extravaganza. Now, 25 is a lot. That's a lot of entries. So if you're keeping score, that's probably going to be a lot of time, right? I want to get out of here in like under an hour, so suffice to say. I don't have all the time in the world to waste, so why don't you go ahead and do your liking and subscribing now. If you want to pre-order any of this stuff, check out TCG Player, link in the description for you down there. Hit me up on Patreon if you really like your boy, and if you like shirts like this, and maybe you want one like it, then check out Dad the Impaler on Etsy, link in the description for that too. He didn't pay me to say that, I just like the dude. But anyway, let's go ahead and get to the list. A Wild Ziggy appears. Now, even a top 25 list needs an honorable mention. This time around, it's going to be Lotus Field, because I don't know if this card's ever going to do anything, ever, but I do know that Lotus Veil is one of my favorite cards of all time. It's a really janky piece from days of yore, from when I was like 12 years old. I've always loved Lotus Veil, and it's not necessarily what you can do with Lotus Veil, but just like what it represents to me. That makes me really like Lotus Field as a card. So even though I'm not really sure what this is going to be in, if anything, I mean, I guess there's some lands matter strategies. People have talked about it with brought back. There's things you can do with it. I'm still not sure it's going to actually do any of those things in this format, but it doesn't have to ever do anything to get me to like it. All right, that's out of the way. Let's go ahead and start the list here with number 25. The only common on the entire list, and that's Winged Words. I do think it's probably the highest power common in the entire set. Look how many just one-drop flyers there are right now. Healer's Hawk, Rustwing Falcon, Siren Storm Tamer, Terramander. There's a bunch more than just that. There's the Flying Flash Sailor one-drop that we got in this set too. There's a ton of one-drop flyers that this goes really well with once you roll around to turn 2. And even if you have to cast it as a divination for all 3 mana every now and again, still card advantage. You rip this off the top of your library later mid-game after a Wrath, still helps you rebuild your board. Card advantage is always welcome, even if it sometimes comes in the form of a divination, which isn't the worst card in the world by itself. But for 2 mana, this is just a post-combat charter course, and that has proven itself to be a ridiculous card. So BlueWhite or even Jeskai Flyers, very real decks, and this will see some play. Well, number 24 is Steel Overseer, and not only because this was a needed reprint for Modern, a little price control on this thing. It's already played in a few decks in that format, not to mention Affinity, obviously, but I think it's a decent card in Standard right now, too. I tried to build the all-colorless deck last season, and it was fun, but not competitive. Let's just put it that way. But with pieces like Steel Overseer and a couple of other things we'll see on this list, I think that colorless actually has like a real chance at being an actual deck, if not only for the next 3 months, but maybe even well beyond that. Steel Overseer represents a really, really good 2-drop for those decks. But there's a card for these colorless decks that I think is even better than Steel Overseer, at least in Standard, and that's Mystic Forge. I think this might be I'm trying to be objective with myself, so it's all the way down here at number 23, but I think this might be one of the top 3 cards I'm most excited to actually brew with from this set, which could be a whole separate list if you wanted it to be, but I think that this is a really, really cool looking card, and it's Experimental Frenzy for the colorless decks. And just like I was saying with Steel Overseer, we've got a critical mass of good colorless stuff in this format. Not only artifacts, but Ugin itself, that looks really good with something like this. Even Ugin's Conjurant, you know? As long as you just get to keep the colorless flow going and you don't get tripped up on lands or anything too much. Mystic Forge looks like exactly the kind of card advantage piece a deck like this needed. But number 22 is 3 mana Soren from this set. We're not going to cover every single Planeswalker in this set in this video. Some didn't make the cut. Soren is actually one that I am one of the most excited about to play with. This just really looked good over the streamer event, and people already had the idea that it might be exactly the piece that Black-White Vampires needs to be a real competitive deck for at least the next few months, while it's still a deck, you know. You've still got Legion Lieutenant and other cards like Sanctum Seeker, for the time being at least. And while we have those cards, something like this is probably going to be the glue piece that really holds that deck together. Turn 3 Champion of Dusk vis-a-vis Soren is maybe one of the best things you can do in all of Standard right now, depending on what you did on the first couple of turns. So Soren just really makes that deck look super overpowered and just supercharged for the next couple of months. Now at number 21, another kind of funky build-around card, and that's Field of the Dead. Now, you can't put funky build-arounds in the top 5 or top 10 if you're going to build it. If you're going to do a top 25 list, you know, these are going to be good in very specific decks. But I'm kind of excited about all those decks. And I will say, even having said that, there's kind of a lot of stuff you can do with Field of the Dead. You could either do the colorless deck. I think this actually does go in that deck. You can get Golos to go search it up. I already talked about that card in the Sleepers video. There's a lot you can do with Golos, especially if you're trying to get Field of the Dead. There's a lot of ways you can build that deck, but again, that speaks to all the versatility inherent in a card like this. There's a ton of different colorless lands in Standard right now, even if that's all you're doing with a card like this. But obviously in 4 and 5 color decks, this works really well too, because again, you're going to be playing a bunch of lands with different names anyway, and those are bound to be mid-rangey or even rampy decks. There are a few decks over the streamer event that played cards that just ramp you lands as much as possible to take advantage of Field of the Dead as quickly as you can in a given game. And in control decks, this just getting a 2-2 almost every single turn can really shut the game out once you've established control. So Field of the Dead is just a free creature factory at a certain point in the game. And whether it's about controlling the game until you get to that point or making that point happen as fast as possible through ramp, there's a lot you can do with Field of the Dead, and I expect there to be a real list for this card at some point in the format. Now to start the top 20 here, I gotta point out temples. I don't think these are quite as impactful as a shock land or even a check land would have been. But that being said, this is about as good as it gets. You know, if you're not going to give us fetch lands or shock lands or something, temples are a really, really good get, especially in a format with the London Mulligan. It's like you'll never have a bad opening hand ever again. Don't ever underestimate lands like this. We made the mistake of doing that when they first came out in Theros block, and they quickly proved themselves. Being able to scry on a duel is just insane. These lands are always better than they look. It's no different this time around. Now, number 19, as we're into the teens now, we're going to look at Flood of Tears for a second. This is another one of those build-arounds that goes in very specific decks, but I think that it's better than some of the other cards I've already covered of that ilk so far, because I think its deck has a real chance of being something like serious for the next few months. This is another deck that's a bit prone to rotation, but for the next few months, you can... Oh, people are setting off fireworks outside. Happy 4th, by the way. I believe they're just sparklers. Hopefully that's all it is, and we're not under attack. As I was saying, due to this card, we've got a pretty ridiculous infinite combo in Standard, at least for the next few months, because you'll cast Flood of Tears, bring 4 permanents back to your hand, or more, doesn't matter. Cast Omniscience for free. That's a good way of abusing this card. At that point, you can just cast anything for free. So what you do is you cast a Tamiyo out of your hand, and at least 3 or 2 other permanents. Then you use Tamiyo to get Flood of Tears back from your graveyard, put it in your hand, cast it for free because Omniscience. That'll pop everything, including Omniscience and Tamiyo, back to your hand. Play it all over again, get Tamiyo to get the Flood of Tears back again, and you are in an infinite loop that if it includes, say, a Hierophant's Chalice or anything else with an ETB effect that can damage the opponent or do something else stupid like gain you life, then you more or less win the game right then and there through an infinite loop. You can make infinite creatures a number of ways by doing this. There's just a lot of ways to abuse this kind of loop, and I expect someone to figure out the correct list at some point in this Standard, and especially in a Standard where 3 mana Teferi is making it really tough for anyone to even consider playing counterspells. A deck like this that goes off in the relative mid-game is actually poised pretty well, so I think that this might be one of the best build-arounds in the entire set. I expect it to go places. Now, number 18 looks like a wonky build-around card, but I think it's actually just a really versatile and bread and butter piece that's going to help out a lot of decks, and that this Bag of Holding. Now, get over the D&D reference, which is really, really cool, and I've yet to get over how awesome it is that there's a D&D item in Magic now. You keep doing that. Please keep doing that, seriously. But still, I think the card is just functionally really good. It only costs 1 mana to put on the battlefield in the first place. Great way to set up on turn 1. It's kind of like a treasure map that will probably replace a card like Treasure Map once it's not in the format anymore. Filters you, that's really sweet, and in the late game, you just trade it in for a bunch of cards. And yeah, hey Ziggy, you can combo this with Heartwarming Redemption and other wheel effects to just lull at the opponent, but I don't think you actually have to do that. I think the card is just good value on its own that is really inexpensive to cast, low investment to get on the battlefield to begin with, might work with any artifact effects. You know, you got a Sai on the battlefield, Saheeli, anything like that. You know, you're playing with Tezzeret in your deck or something like that. It goes in artifact strategies is all I'm saying. Instantly the strongest one drop in the format for those decks. Goes well in the colorless decks that I was gathering on about earlier. And again, you just trade it in for value later at the end of your opponent's turn, or maybe you have to respond to something, you don't have any cards in your hand, cash in your bag and see what's in there. There's just a lot of cool stuff you can do with this, and I expect cool things to be done for the next at least year while this is in the format. It's a better card than it looks like. But number 17 is ElvishReclaimer, a card whose power level is pretty self-evident. Just reading the card, it looks pretty good. A 1 mana, 1/2, so it doesn't die to Goblin Chainwhirler in Standard. That's pretty neat. That's kind of cool right there, but it also gets bigger as the game goes on. Rewards you for doing the thing it wants to do anyway. You know, it synergizes with itself by putting lands in the graveyard, and eventually gets really big. Also synergizes with Lotus Field. We'll probably see these two together an awful lot. Not to mention the fact that it's crop rotation on a stick. It's a pretty silly thing for a card to be, not only in Standard, but in Eternal formats and Commander, for that matter. There's so much you can do with this. Go search up a Gia's Cradle or something like that. Like, yes ma'am, we'll do that all day. I just think the card has plenty of play in plenty of formats, and there's probably a lot that can be done with it in Standard that we just haven't really explored yet. Now, number 16 is the real reason why I expect these blue-white flying decks to be a real, actual thing in this format, and that's Sephiroth. Sephiroth? It's a good card. It turns out that a turn 3 doesn't even cost you all your mana on that turn. 7/7 flying lifelink, that's good. Those are good stats. You want something that beats Resplendent Angel on turn 3 for these flying decks, this is probably what you'd rather be playing. I already kind of briefly brought up all the 1-drop flyers that are in this format right now. There's at least like 16 you could play, 4 different 1-drop flyers. And really you could easily get to 21-drop flyers now that I think about it. So that means you could play a 1-drop flyer on turn 1, 2 of them on turn 2, and then another one on turn 3, and still have a mana to play this, and then actually still have another mana left open for, say, a God's Willing or something if you need to protect your Sephara. That seems like a really tough play line to beat, as far as I'm concerned, and Blue-White Flyers is getting all the pieces it needs to actually be considered. It's always been a draft deck in the past, but with things like Winged Words and now Sephara has just, if this attacks even once, the game is more or less over. How's a 14-point life swing bump? Or just take out their biggest thing and gain 7 life. Like, it's just really going to be tough to beat this card, even if it gets to attack just once, and it's often going to be able to do that on turn 4. That's just a ridiculous play sequence for almost any deck to have to deal with. Even like decks with 3 mana Teferi, this card doesn't necessarily laugh at, but it's still okay because you're just going to be able to play it over again on the next turn anyway. And you'll probably have plenty of flyers to chip in on Teferi and kill it if they did -3 it to pop this back to your hand. So there's just so many cool play lines that I think can be done with this card, and I think there's a lot to be said about it. It's a very real card, and if there's anything that makes Blue-White Flyers an actual deck, it's Sephara. But Sephara is not the only way to get 7 power on turn 3. There's a creature that you don't have to jump through any hoops to get that for at all. That's number 15, Rotting Regisaur. Reggie is super serial and might actually make you want to put black into your dinosaur deck. It looks really good in Jund Dinosaurs or something. Just 7 power on turn 3, perhaps even turn 2 after Elanor Elves is so crazy, and I would imagine a lot of decks will fall to this. Even in decks where you're not really taking advantage of the discard on this card, you're just dropping something in the graveyard every turn because you don't care. You get to swing for 7 after turn 3 or even turn 2. It just seems incredible, but there's plenty of ways to make this into an upside too. Reanimator decks will really want this. Plus there's Jumpstart and all kinds of crazy stuff to do out of your graveyard, so there's a ton of ways to turn this into an upside. And a 3 mana 7/6, yeah, it might be vanilla apart from that, but it still looks like a mistake when you see these stats on paper. The card is just outrageous. And you know, it plays nicely on curve with number 14, Blood for Bones. This is probably another one of those cards that's in like the top 3 cards I want to brew with the most list, you know. Like, I love Blood for Bones so much. I've been waiting for a 4-mana reanimation piece in Standard again, and I think this is actually better than Zombify, the more I think about it. The fact that you can get the creature that you sacrifice rack back to your hand and then repeat its enter the battlefield trigger 2 on the next turn, or even that same turn depending on how much mana you have, that's just absolutely insane. And even if you're just playing this for value, it's a crazy card, but it also allows you to get like Villas on turn 3, so it's not fair either. It's an insane card. Just imagine a scenario, and it's not Christmas Land, it's just what the deck wants to do. You play 4 of all these cards, but anyway, you turn 1 Lana Rel's, turn 2 Rotting Regisaur, turn 3 swing with Regisaur, and then on your second main phase, you sacrifice it to Blood for Bones, get the Villas back from your graveyard that you dropped there, that upkeep, and then it's cool. You just get Rotting Regisaur back in your hand. It's alright. It's alright, brother. So, I actually think this deck looks very, very serious, and there's so much more you can do with Blood for Bones than just that. Not only is there black-green, there's also mono-black with cards like Stitcher's Supplier, but back to black-green with like Low Spore Shaman. There's black-red, there's Dimir, there's just so much that Blood for Bones allows you to do, and it's picking the right list that's going to be the real problem, but as far as the card seeing play, I don't think that's much of an issue at all. That's going to happen. But, that said, Blood for Bones still isn't even the best uncommon in the set. Far from it, actually. There's a couple more on the list. In quick succession here, actually, because number 13 is Goblin Ringleader. I think this looks really good for Modern, obviously. You know, we have this, plus Ether Vial in Modern still, and Goblin Matrons in the format, which means we just have extended goblins, or legacy goblins, whatever you want to call it, like old back-in-the-day goblins that used to be one of the most feared decks in that format once upon a long time ago. And so just the fact that we can build that deck in Modern now has me and a bunch of other people really, really jacked, but obviously this is just dang old fine and standard goblins too. So I think this card's going to go a long way in multiple formats, and it's nice to have a reprinting for Commander too for what that's worth. So got to point the card out at some point. I think it's definitely one of the best cards in the set too. But still, not my favorite uncommon in the set. Number 12 is Risen Reef, which is also not my favorite uncommon in the set, but we'll get to it in just a second. In case you haven't seen yet, there's a reason this card is like at the almost exact halfway point on the list, and that's because if you've been on Twitter or Spikes or any website where pros write articles, I mean, it's been all over the place for the last few days now, then you've probably seen the good news about Risen Reef. This is just the glue that holds together the Temur or even Simic Elementals deck. And there's been plenty of arguments about why that deck doesn't even need to be Temur. Doesn't need Omnath, doesn't need Living Twister, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure I buy that, but at the same time, there's been plenty of arguments for Simic, and most of those revolve around how good Risen Reef is. Not only is this enter the battlefield trigger on Reef itself pretty good, but the fact that every elemental that enters the battlefield afterwards gets you 2 of these triggers is just crazy. This goes with 3 Mana Chandra, like Gangbusters, and pretty much any other elemental that you could play. This goes just absolutely insane with. Just getting the value on every elemental after you play a Risen Reef is just crazy, and it makes a 3-mana 1/1 a must-kill. And that's it. It's like, when's the last time you could say that? It's just an unbelievable card. It's way better than Elvish Rejuvenator, the thing that we all sort of, you know, compared it to. It's like an Elvish Rejuvenator stapled to a Coiling Oracle. It's like, yeah, it turns out it's just better than that. Because you're gonna get this effect. If what we've seen of the Temur Elementals deck so far is any indicator, you're going to get this effect, I don't know, 8 times a game, like 4 at the very least, you know. If they don't kill your Reef immediately, it's just going to lead to the most value you could possibly imagine. And this card probably could have been rare, pretty easily. But just that uncommon card is crazy. It's a steal. I don't know why it's this low a rarity. So it turns out it's way more powerful than any of us judged to begin with, so it's going to be at the halfway point in the list. Card is insane. But my favorite uncommons in the set, notice the S there, are the cycle of color hosing uncommons. I think these are easily going to be the most impactful cards in the set. A few of them specifically. Now, one of them I'm leaving off for now. We'll get to it a little bit later because it's not uncommon. It's rare. But as far as the uncommon cycle of these, things like Fry, for instance, are going to be insanely important in the upcoming format. Not only do these take out Teferis, that's probably the first thing you notice about them, is that obviously 3 mana Teferi, but even 5 mana Teferi can be pretty easily taken out by this card. But also Nick All Boluses and Lyra Dawnbringers, a bunch of other important stuff. Tempest Djinn, you know, there's a ton of things in this format that a card like this can just kill outright. But there's even, say, the black one, which I'm going to look at my notebook to make sure I remember the name of. Noxious Grasp, I knew that the entire time. That one looks really good too. Not only does this take out, again, Lyra Dawnbringer, Teferis and stuff like that, but it's going to take out Nissas and a bunch of other things that are going to be otherwise kind of difficult to take out, especially at a mana value like this, just 2 mana. But number 10, here we go, with Scheming Symmetry. I know not everyone's going to agree with this, but I think anytime you see a 1-mana tutor, you just pay attention to it. There's a reason. That, like, Imperial Seal, I think, is the, like, Portal 3 Kingdoms version of this card, loosely, at least. There's a reason that card is played inexpensive in Commander. And cards like Vampiric Tutor, for instance, are like legendary cards in the game of Magic. And I know this isn't a Vampiric Tutor or anything, but given that in this standard environment, I'm not even talking about Legacy or Eternal formats or Commander, but just in Standard, one of the least powerful constructed formats. I think that just 3 mana Teferi makes this card playable. Any sorcery you have to look twice at. And the fact that you can cast this at instant speed at the end of your opponent's turn and draw your card first, I think it's going to be really, really important just in and of itself. But we've also got cards like, I don't know, Opt, Chart of Course, a million things that draw a card. Maybe you put something on top with Scheming Symmetry, Scheming Symmetry, and then you just Narse it or something. Or, you know, 5 mana Teferi will draw you a card. Or return something to their hand with 3 mana Teferi and draw it. You know, there's just a million ways to draw the card immediately when you Scheming Symmetry. So I don't think this card is nearly as bad as some people are saying it is. And a 1-mana tutor is just always something you pay attention to. And again, that's just Standard. I'm not talking about formats that have access to cards like, I don't know, Brainstorm and other like 1-mana cards that easily draw this. But again, even in Standard, we've got Opt, so I just don't think the card is bad at all. And combo decks are going to really love a piece like this where you kind of don't care what you're giving your opponent because you're going to win the game right then and there. So 1-mana tutors are good. That's my contention. Now, I'm going to go ahead and warn you. For the next couple, I'm going to cheat just a little bit, but I'm still going to pick one card that I like the most. But I'm still going to name Cycles for these next couple of slots. So just keep that in mind. Number 9 are the Cavaliers. But if I had to pick one, I would say the white one. I like Cavalier of Dawn the most out of all of these. But don't get me wrong, I really like the black one. That was a struggle. Is it going to be Cavalier of Night, Cavalier of Dawn? I think Cavalier of Night is just behind the white one, but then there's the blue one, which looks really good too, and like really hard to kill, but there's still plenty of exile effects for the time being in Standard. And I think this is probably not a dead card entirely, but not as good as it looks. Not quite as good, at least. So I like the blue one, but not as much. I like the red one, but not as much as the blue one. And I think the green one is probably breakable in some way or another. But again, just not my favorite of the cycle. There's plenty of reasons the white one is, though. If you've already seen the Sleepers video, just go look at the bit for Retributive Wand. And that'll tell you a lot of why I think this card is very good. But obviously it plays well outside of Retributive Wand for a lot of reasons. Not only does that say non-land permanent, so it just busts up a Planeswalker immediately, and that's going to be really important. A very good answer for these white decks, because mostly mono white decks especially. But even control decks that leaned heavily on white for removal, they have like Prison Realm and Ixalan's Binding and stuff that can just be blown up by an Ovivian or something like that. And that sometimes is very bad. So it makes their Cleansing Nova live in the mirror match and stuff. They can just name enchantments. So it's nice to have something that just get rid of that thing. Just get rid of that thing. Don't put an enchantment on it. You can blow up later and get it back. So I like that aspect of it. But you can also blow up your own stuff. Not only your Retributive Wand, but a Hunted Witness. Blow up a Hunted Witness or a creature with Afterlife. And you get a 1/1 and a 3/3 and a 4/6 with Vigilance. That seems really good. And then when it dies, there's tons of stuff you can do with this. A lot of people are saying this is ancillary and that it's probably the hardest part of the card to get value from, but I don't think so at all. Not only is there, again, Retributive Wand. I'll bring that card up again, but there's plenty of artifacts you might want to get back, an Immortal Sun or Treasure Map that died to removal for some reason or another. But, again, that's just incidental. For all we know, there's an artifact theme in an upcoming set that goes really well with this. Or if we go back to Theros, like everyone is theorizing that we will, this card will be very good with all the enchantments that are sure to be in that set. But right now, now this gets back a History of Benalia, or any other saga, but especially a History of Benalia, to great effect. So I just think there's so much more you can do even with the second line of text that a lot of people are giving it credit for. The body is stout, a good price for what you're getting, and a lot of ways to get value out of it. So I think this is probably my favorite Cavalier in the entire cycle, but I got to put the entire cycle at number 9 here. I think there's just so much you can do with them that they deserve a whole slot unto themselves. Now, similarly, here at number 8, I'm going to say Gold Legends, but I got to pick one that I like the most. Now, for a long time, I've waffled back and forth because I want Omnath to be number 1, but Omnath is somewhat restricted to being played in the elemental decks. Not all the way restricted to being played in the elemental decks, mind you, but I think that's mostly where it shines, and I want something with a little bit more mass appeal. Same thing with Kaalia. Kaalia is probably my favorite of all of these on a personal level, and I think there's so much you can do with this. It's like a mini Niv Mizzet that draws you a few cards when it comes into play. It comes down earlier than Niv Mizzet, easier to cast. Just I like a lot about Kaalia, and I'm going to build this deck at some point in the season because Mardu is maybe my favorite like 3-color combination. So it's just really want to do it, and I love Kaalia, but she's not the best of these. Now, similarly, in terms of the 3-mana legends from this cycle, the other one is the Abzan one, and it looks very good too. I'm bound to build this deck at some point. It's already in the Patreon poll for the first deck of the season, but it'll stay in the Patreon poll as the season goes on. I want to build this deck too, and I think it makes a lot of cards playable from Dominaria that have been waiting to be playable for a really long time now. So, especially like the legendary spells, this looks really good with all of those. But still, it's restricted to a very particular deck. I think that if it came down to my favorite one of these, it's probably Yarok. Not only is this like a Panharmonicon, it's actually better in some ways, because this is like all the permanent types. You know, Panharmonicon, I believe, is creatures and artifacts. But this will trigger off lands and stuff too, so that could be really, really cool, depending on how you play it. So I think there's a lot of versatility on a card like this. A 3/5 lifelink on turn 4 or even 3 some of the time is really good for just brick walling aggro decks. So I love the stats on this too. Lifelink is always a better ability than it gets credit for. So I love so much about this card, just in terms of the value you're getting up front, the stats that you're getting out of the card, and obviously the wacky stuff you can do with it. And again, I think this really makes you reevaluate some of the creatures in the format that are already good, like Golgari Finebreaker, Ravenous Chupacabra, that can be made better by a card like this. So really excited to brew with it, and it's probably, to my mind at least, the best of, again, I'm trying to be objective here, but I can't say it's all the way objective. To my mind, the best of these Gold Legends from the set. But the Gold Legends all look good enough, I think they get their own entry. Now, number 7, I'm excited about. This has a shot at being the most controversial entry on the entire list, but I really don't think that people are evaluating Mu Yanling correctly. I think this is probably one of the best Planeswalkers in the entire set, by a large margin. I know, like, for instance, I've seen a couple of content creators put the 4-mana Vivian from this set on their list, and I think that Mu Yanling is at a comparable power level. I really like that Vivian, but if I had to pick the one that I hope or think even will do better in this upcoming standard, I think Mu Yanling is really under a lot of people's radar right now. This protects itself in 2 important ways. That's good for a Planeswalker to do. And if you do eventually get to the ultimate, it's not win the game, but it's very close to that. Being able to just tap islands to draw cards is outrageous. Hand clapping emojis. That's actually really, really good if you do get to the ultimate. And it's not so far-fetched that you might. But in the meantime, if all you're doing with it is just creating 4/4 elemental birds, like, that's pretty good too. And again, if you create any more than one over the course of a game, then this is just a win condition that's also a defensive piece in the meantime, and that's kind of the best thing a Planeswalker can do, especially one that only costs 3 mana. That's already good enough. 3-mana Planeswalkers are something you really have to pay attention to, and I think they really stacked this one. But number 6 is a card everyone's caught on to, and that's Icon of Ancestry. Not only does this help out the tribal decks that are all rotating out in the next couple of months here, things like vampires and even dinosaurs I've seen this in, but merfolk obviously, but it helps out the elementals decks too on occasion. And if you're trying to do something crazy with Arcane Adaptation for the next couple of months, Icon is a great card too for that. But this has great standard play as just a 3-mana Anthem effect any tribe can play that also provides card advantage. That's so much for an upfront investment of 3 mana. That is very, very good almost no matter what point of the game you play it. And it's really good in Commander too. I mean, I'm jabbering on about Standard here, but this is obviously going to see Commander play until the end of time in pretty much every tribal deck, which is a lot of Commander decks. So this has got to be in the top 10. Well, we've cracked the top 5, so we got to talk about leylines real quick. Not only did we get to see a few leylines reprinted that we really needed, the black one, the white one, these are great reprints for Modern, but we got some new ones too. And at first, people were saying the green one was terrible, but now I keep hearing that the green one is the most busted one. You get it on turn 1 for free. It just leads to these starts where you're able to produce, I don't know, 300 mana on turn 3. some of the fisherman's tales that I've heard with the green leyline already are pretty crazy. So if this card lives up to its potential, it might be very, very real. But if nothing else, we got the black and white ones back. And that's a crazy reprint that needs to be pointed out because it's a price control on Modern that needed to happen, and it's going to keep decks like, Arclight Phoenix and my beloved Blood for Bones in check in this format. As will Grafdigger's Cage. I should at least point this card out. It didn't actually make the list, but this will help against graveyard-based decks. But we've also got the black leyline for that, and if Burn wanted to ever be a deck, well, those hopes are pretty much dashed now that we got the white leyline in Standard. But hey, speaking of Burn, let's get to number 4, 3-mana Chandra. The first Chandra we've encountered on our journey here. Now, some people were saying this underperformed, some people were saying it overperformed. There were a lot of different takes on this card over the streamer event, but so far I still think the card has shown a lot of promise in a lot of different decks, not only the mono red Chandra deck, but again in the Temur Elementals deck this has done a little bit of work. This is pretty good almost no matter what the board state is. It's not super great when you're behind, but it does allow you to replay card draw spells and removal spells out of your graveyard, which is probably the best part of the card. But if you're playing against control, it's a free creature factory pretty much every turn too, and in decks with a lot of planeswalkers, which is a lot of decks right now, that first ability is pretty nice too. So I like a lot about this Chandra, and if nothing else, the ability to just give spells in your graveyard flashback is going to push this card into playability in Standard and well beyond too. I think this card has a real shot in Modern. Well, we are in the top 3, everybody. Number 3 is brought back. Yeah, all the way up here cracking the top 3 because two things. One, there are plenty of crazy things you can do with this right now. I've already talked about the Lotus Field interaction, but there's just mono white decks that might want to get a creature back from combat or get a History of Benalia back that died to just chapter 3ing, There's a ton of ways to use brought back just in Standard, but in multiple combo decks in Standard this works. Combo decks in Commander you might want a piece like this. Plenty of ways to go tutor it up or get it out of your graveyard or something. A lot of ways to use this in Modern too. A card like Collected Company, this isn't necessarily, but it reminds me of Collected Company in some ways, because there are plenty of ways, especially in older formats, to really curate your graveyard over the course of a turn and figure out the best ways to use a card like this. It's a Revelark that doesn't have as many restrictions or cost as much either, and I love Revelarks, and there's just so much more you can do with this. It's just a crazy looking card to me, and that's just on the one hand. On the other hand, a card like this really makes you evaluate, I don't know, literally everything that's ever printed from here on out, because if the card isn't broken now, it will be broken at some point in the future. This is the kind of card that's just begging to have some sort of insanely broken interaction rear its ugly head, and if it doesn't in the next few months, it will probably happen at some point in the next few years as sets continue to get printed, because it turns out that's a thing that happens in Magic the Gathering. I'm telling you, if the card's not broken right now, it will be. But all the way up here at number 2, I've got Shifting Seratops, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of the most impactful cards in the entire set, hands down for the Standard environment. Now, it might not have as much clout, hate that word, in other formats. I guess Limited, yeah, it's a bomb. But in like Modern, you're probably not going to play this card unless you do. I don't know. But in Legacy and Commander even, I really don't see this card getting a ton of play. But in Standard, it's not only a guaranteed drop in the Naya or Green Red or even Jund Dinosaurs deck. You play this in Dinosaurs. That's a no-brainer. But I just think that it's a main deckable piece that's insanely good against any Planeswalker whose name starts with a T that's not Tibble. That's probably pretty good against Tibble, but you know what I'm getting at. Against Teferis, this is easily the single best new card in the entire set as far as I'm concerned. You wait a turn or two, you can drop it with haste and go ahead and eat that Teferi, but you don't have to. You can just drop it right then and there. It's not counterable, and they're not going to be able to return it to your hand or tuck it 3 cards into your library. So much about shifting Seratops, and yeah, it can be taken out by a cast down or something, and that does kind of suck. The card is balanced. I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but for the time being, this is going to be the preferred Teferi killer of choice, and I think that it really gives green decks a leg up they did not previously have, and I think this card means a lot. Now, on to my number 1 here. You may have noticed, especially with that last entry, that I value 2 things a lot. Does it change the face of Standard, and does it do that by fighting control decks specifically Teferi? Specifically Teferi. Well, my number 1 does those things more and better than pretty much any other card in the entire set, and it does more than just fight Esper. This also fights aggro, mid-range decks, goes above most things in the format, and provides more value than pretty much any other card in the set, so long as you can keep it out, and you're guaranteed to resolve it every time. Number 1 is 6 Mana Chandra. I know, it's predictable, and multiple people have made this their number 1. I'm not just throwing my voice on the pile here, but I'm throwing my voice on the pile, because honestly, I don't know how you could not rate this as the number 1 card in the set, at least from a Standard perspective. If you play Standard, I think this card has more impact than any card in the set by leaps and bounds. Again, it's going to resolve no matter what, even if people do start playing counter spells again. But until then, it's just insanely good against, again, any planeswalker that's blue. You know? But especially Teferis and such, it just takes them out, you know, on sight. And its plus ability is something that a Teferi can never interact with, which is really important. Emblems still, to this day, cannot be interacted with. And especially once you start getting multiple emblems on them, it kind of doesn't matter if they do draw the Vraska's Contempt or a way to bounce this back to your hand or whatever. It kind of doesn't matter. They're going to continue to take damage every turn. They can't just dirtle their way through the game until you run out of cards anymore. They have to actually finish you off. So I think that, if anything, this changes the face of control decks in Standard, and is a great card against them. Obviously, control decks could shift from Esper into Jeskai, because you can just play this with Teferis too. It might make decks like Jund or Naya very, very real again. There's just so many implications with a card like this for not only mid-range, but also control decks, and I think it's easily the best 6-mana Planeswalker in Standard, and that's kind of a high bar right now, because we already had Liliana, but this is even more exciting to me, and Liliana and Ugin were already ridiculous cards, so I just think that if you're picking the best cards in the set, this has to be at the very front of the list, because it just does so much to change Standard as we know it. But that is my list. We finally made it through. It'll take 6 hours. I'm just glad you're still here. And if you are, make sure you do the things. Like the video, hit up the Patreon, order singles and stuff through TCG Player. This looks like a pretty good set, so pull the trigger on that. Get yourself some singles or some sealed product. There's other things you can do, though. I guess subscribe to the channel. It's almost Deck Tech season. And if you do join the Patreon now, you'll be able to vote on what decks you want to see all throughout the season. But we've got our first deck of the season poll going on right now in Saturday night, so make sure you go ahead and get in there if you haven't done that yet. But pretty sure I'm done now, so let me know how you felt about this one. I know there's some controversial stuff here, so let me know what didn't make the list. If there's something that didn't, check out the Sleepers video. If you haven't seen that yet, your favorite cards might actually be hiding on that list. So check that out, but let me know how you'd have done things differently, or if what you disagree with, whatever. It's important. I read your comments. So let's talk about the set before we actually start getting into Deck Tech season. There's a lot more to talk about. This looks like an insane core set. So let's get into it down there, I guess. You know? Let's do that. Anyway, I guess I'm done jabbering on for this one. Ziggy, you have been here the whole time getting chin scratches. You're a good bub. But anyway, I guess I'll catch you cats later. I'm dead from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.